Here's your sign.
Hello, I'm Janet Harris, President of the Indiana Council on World Affairs. The United States foreign aid has been continuing peace building and humanitarian investment in other countries for many decades. However, the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, abruptly and significantly reduced these long-standing initiatives. For example, USAID was shut down July 1st, as explained at our September meeting. This evening continues our discussion on this very important concept. U.S. foreign aid humanitarian funding will be covered. The moderator for this program is Dr. Betty Tonsing, board member and vice president of programs for the council. Betty spent 15 years overseas on contracts with the United Nations, USAID, including through Catholic Relief Services, and the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, and through the State Department as a Fulbright Scholar and Senior Fulbright Specialist. She served in Africa, Central Asia, and the Middle East. Dr. Tonsing will now introduce the panel. Betty?
Thank you.
Dr. Tonsing?
Thanks, Janet. I tell my students that the history of the world includes culture, migration, and wars. As the world grew with the ability to travel larger distances, wars expanded over larger territories. Then in the 20th century, few places on Earth were untouched by two deadly wars, separated only by a couple decades and exacerbated by a global depression. And the Second World War ended with the nuclear capability to end all wars and life altogether. This was not sustainable. The First World War moved the U.S. into a position as a global power, and this was cemented by World War II. And we were the only ones at that point with a nuclear bomb. We had a choice: continue this madness or create a new hope of alliances with countries that we had fought against, even with countries we had fought against, into a different world relationship. And with our new position as a global leader, led the way with massive aid such as the Marshall Plan that promised aid and helped with immediate food assistance and reconstruction if countries rejected communism and embraced a civil society with other nations and a free market economy. The Fulbright program was established in 1946 for academic and cultural exchanges aimed at further fostering global understanding and diplomacy. A series of other agencies cropped up through the 1950s to help further support national security, and Truman's four-point program was created to assist developing countries with technical knowledge. The goals were to reduce poverty, increase production to create markets for the U.S., and counter communism by promoting economic growth. Our Department of War was renamed the Department of Defense, with a new focus on national security through prevention and cooperation with allies rather than just battle plans, and saw long-term development aid as a powerful tool to help in this goal. In 1961, prompted by a pressing Cold War, President Kennedy created what we know today as the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, through the Foreign Assistance Act, making it a permanent agency and mission to assist with technical and capital assistance and early programs that included economic development, linked education, agriculture, combating malnutrition, and food scarcity. Health programs linked to disease prevention and access to health clinics and care also became a major focus. USAID played a major role in helping to curtail or eradicate diseases such as HIV/AIDS through the enormously successful PEPFAR program. It helped eradicate malaria in areas, tuberculosis, waterborne diseases, COVID, polio, and Ebola. More pregnant mothers not only lived through their pregnancies, more mothers had healthy babies. USAID became the world's largest development aid agency, though its budget was less than 1% of the overall U.S. budget. Some complained it was draining a budget of our nation's needs. Yet the percent of our U.S. GDP that went toward international assistance was less than that of other developed countries. Half of USAID's funding was channeled through nonprofits or non-governmental organizations to provide direct services literally at the ground level. Organizations such as Catholic Relief Services, Save the Children, and World Vision. For example, the Catholic Relief Services, which is huge with a $3 billion budget, half of their budget came from USAID. In more recent years, USAID provided assistance with building systems needed for functioning democracies and economies, including newly developed independent countries and those emerging or embroiled in complex internal conflicts. To this end, USAID worked hand in hand with the Department of State, the Department of Defense, and other similar agencies to help reduce conflict, promote stability and diplomacy. And all of this abruptly ended on the day of Trump's inauguration with a work stop order and Musk gleefully declaring USAID and other foreign aid was ending up in the wood chipper. Since then, models from epidemiological researchers report that the dismantling of USAID alone has resulted in 600,000 deaths, 2/3 of them children. Public health officials warn that if foreign aid cuts continue, more than 14 million additional preventable deaths will occur by 2030. And that's where we begin this evening. Michelle Dworkin was a Foreign Service Officer for USAID with international assignments that included Colombia, Honduras, and Guatemala, Afghanistan, and Egypt, as well as Washington, D.C. Her most recent assignment included a $1.2 billion portfolio of programs focused on peace building, counter-narcotics, economic growth, biodiversity, conservation, and Venezuelan migrant support. She has a master's in sustainable international development from Brandeis University, an undergraduate degree in international relations and anthropology from Tufts University. You have to excuse me, I have a bit of a cold, been indoors and breathing dust like all of us have under the polar vortex, so excuse me. Dr. Kevin McNamara was chief of party for USAID, as well as consulting contractor for USAID, State Department, U.S. Defense, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture on agriculture and infrastructure development with multi-year projects in Afghanistan. Professor Emeritus at Purdue University, he was awarded an Alexander von Humboldt Senior Research Fellowship, Hudson Research Fellowship, and Indiana Economic Development Council Fellowship, and the USDA Secretary's Honor Award for exceptional service. Dr. Ken Holland, in addition to being a fellow board member, is President Emeritus of the American University of Afghanistan and served as chief of party for USAID and consulting contractor to NATO. A chief of party is somebody who comes in and heads up, is the chief manager, CEO for an aid project in a country. But a consulting contractor to NATO, the Department of Defense, and the Department of State on matters of education and building rule of law. He is Dean Emeritus for International Relations at Ball State University, with international assignments that include Afghanistan, Mongolia, Myanmar, Iraq, Cambodia, Pakistan, India, and Uzbekistan. This is all to say that we have a powerful panel of profound expertise to address this question. Michelle, I want the first question to go to you. I want to open the panel with a question that to please explain the difference between humanitarian assistance and long-term development in relation to the work of U.S. foreign aid, of which USAID is part of, major part, but of U.S. foreign aid, and who in the U.S. government, other than the State Department, would take on this responsibility now with USAID dissolved.
All right. Thank you so much for the question, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight. So sometimes when people would think of USAID, what would immediately come to mind would be kind of the delivering of food and immediate medical assistance and such, and that was part of what we did. But it was not the main thrust of what we did or the main purpose of our mission. So fiscal year 2023 funds, which were the last year of funds that we were able to manage as USAID, humanitarian assistance was about $9.4 billion. And that included the emergency food assistance response to disasters, which included both natural disasters as well as man-made conflict. By contrast, our long-term development assistance for fiscal year 2023 funds was $33 billion. So you can see it's quite a bit more. And that included funding for things like democracy building, civil society strengthening, economic growth, health, education, environmental protection, climate change adaptation assistance, all of which, were intended to be sustainable over the long term. So, just as some examples, one of my posts, as Betty mentioned, was Honduras, where I served for 4 years. While I was there, Honduras, along with a number of other countries, were hit in November 2020 by back-to-back Category 4 hurricanes, Eta and Iota. And so we got a lot of humanitarian assistance for that, to provide immediate relief. However, most of our work in Honduras was focused on things like improving citizen security, addressing at-risk youth at risk of being pulled into violence, working on agriculture programs, linking farmers to markets, addressing corruption, and that sort of thing. So, for example, we supported coffee growers. We linked people who had migrated to the United States and been deported, linked them to opportunities upon their return, and also built up local Honduran organizations to hold their own government accountable and support oversight of funds. So in terms of who's taking this on, I would say the State Department is only nominally taking this on. Basically all of USAID's staff was completely fired, and that was our American staff in the US, our American staff overseas, and our Foreign Service nationals. So our nationals of the countries where we worked, who are our institutional memory, who really kept things going over decades. So everybody was let go. The State Department has brought back, the numbers that I've heard are about 700 people, but even that's not really clear because the whole process has been so non-transparent. But previously, USAID had 10,000 employees. So they've brought back less than 10% of the staff. And it's also not even clear what funding is being programmed. Even funds that were appropriated in FY20 for fiscal year 2025 are not being programmed to the extent that they're supposed to be as directed by Congress. And the State Department is a policy-making entity, not a management of foreign aid entity. And so they really lack the financial, contracting, legal expertise, et cetera, plus the technical expertise to even do this. So yes, there is some humanitarian, some health programming moving forward, but it's being done, I think, in a very non-strategic way by a staff that is too small and lacks experience.
And when you mention the foreign nationals, these would be the people who are living in various countries who know their country and who are there as USAID foreign service officers come for a period of time and then go and somewhere else. Those people stay, and they are the tie that binds, right?
Correct. Yes. So we, would go for a period of, depending on the post, 1 to 4 years. But the Foreign Service nationals are nationals of the countries where we were working, who really maintained those local relationships, who have deep, deep historical and institutional knowledge about their governments, their cultures, their languages,
conflicts happening, sensitivities, et cetera. Plus all of the historical knowledge about what USAID had done over decades in their countries. And so, really in addition, as bad as it was that, all of us were let go, for Foreign Service nationals in some countries, they're not just facing, trying to find new jobs, but in some countries where the relationship with the US government has been hostile. I'm thinking of places like Nicaragua, for example, where USAID was doing democracy programming that was not viewed favorably by the host country government. Our Foreign Service nationals are really also at great personal risk right now, trying to get new jobs and figure out their lives, knowing, with everyone knowing, oh, they were working for the US government before on this democracy stuff, and they no longer have the protection of working for us anymore.
Yeah. Michelle and Ken, I want to bring you in on this next question. Many are familiar with the humanitarian goals of U.S. foreign assistance, but may not be with soft power. And the use of the word soft power may be the first time people heard that linked with they would think of food, they would think of healthcare, starving babies, and the soft power linked to our U.S. national security, global national security, but U.S. How was USAID and other foreign assistance linked to our national security and our diplomacy? And now, without the features that supported our national security through soft power, that included data collection, tracking possible danger areas and people, which is again where the Foreign Service nationals would have that history on the ground. What does safety now look like for the US? How is this impacted? So maybe you'd like to start with that.
Sure. So there's a basic misunderstanding about foreign assistance. It's not charity.
Right.
It's actually an essential part of our national security. It's often said that there are three tools to make America safer in its dealings with foreign countries. So Michelle mentioned the State Department. That's diplomacy is a tool for national security. We mentioned the military, that's defense. That's another instrument to promote national security. But the third one is just as important, and that's foreign assistance, which is called development. So think of national security as sitting on a three-legged stool: diplomacy, defense, and development. I'll give you a very practical example, and Kevin will know a great deal about this as well. So one of the devices that was used in both Iraq and in Afghanistan to bring about stabilization in those countries was something called the Provincial Reconstruction Team, the PRT. And when you went into a PRT, you saw three kinds of individuals working in them. There were obviously they were all run by the military. So you had a general or a colonel commanding the armed forces assigned to the PRT. You had State Department officers, Foreign Service officers in the PRT, but you also had USAID in the PRT. And I actually wrote an article about the PRT in Kandahar, and which I talk about how the three elements work together. So there's a very practical example. When you talk, we had a program with General Petraeus recently, sponsored by the Indiana Council on World Affairs. I actually worked for General Petraeus, and my job was to help promote the rule of law in Afghanistan. But General Petraeus had asked for me. He said, we really need civilian experts to further the military mission in Afghanistan. So providing a rule of law to the people was one way of beating the insurgency. It was an element of counterinsurgency. So what foreign assistance does, think of it in some ways as prevention. Mm-hmm. when we have foreign service officers, but primarily when we have USAID officers and contractors like myself and Kevin, when we're in a foreign country, we're in places where the military is not, where diplomats are not. We're in the countrysides, we're in the villages, we're dealing with civilian agencies and with the common people. And so we know what's going on inside those countries, and we can let Washington know, okay, there's an insurgency building up. There's a famine is coming. There's an epidemic is developing. So we're kind of the eyes and ears in places where there really are no other officers of the United States government. Obviously, the Peace Corps also contributes, to that kind of mission as well. And so foreign assistance is really a key part. It has always been a key part of American security because it's a way of preventing armed conflict, and it's a way of anticipating problems before they become too difficult to manage with civilian means. And this is another issue. If you take one leg off of that stool of national security, you're left with diplomacy and defense. And think of the US military as a blunt instrument. It's like if the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem is a nail. So it leads to more instability, less security for the American people, because there's going to be more armed conflict in the world.
I need to go on to the next question. I'm keeping an eye on time, because one of the things we clearly want to do, for those of you who've done this before, is we will have a public Q&A, and I know you've got questions. And Michelle, I will be looping back with you to add more to that, but I just noticed the time at 7:25. And actually, Michelle, you can weigh in on this because of your expertise with Kevin, please. So who's filling the gap? With countries with USAID's work related to new emerging economies that want to function as civil societies. I want to mention here that trade is a part of this, that people may not know that one of the earlier recipients of USAID, I think people think, oh, we're just giving money to poor countries who hate us, what have you. No, India and China were early recipients. Correct me if I'm wrong. Now they're our major trading partners. One of the goals of USAID is to help people become sustainable and to do what they want to do, be in that broader market of trade for their own prosperity. But who's filling the gap? And what does that mean for the US? What does that mean for the countries? But what does that mean for the US? Can we regain our position in the future, assuming that when we move on to another administration that's more amenable to this work, we will reconstruct a new position in foreign aid? What that might look like, we don't know. We'll get to that later. But who's filling in the gap? Kevin and Michelle, can you address that, please? Kevin, I'll start with you.
Yeah, okay. So the U.S. provided 30 to 40% of humanitarian aid for health emergencies, for disasters. For the development activities, the U.S. provided 20 to 25%. So it leaves a very, very big gap. And there's really some countries moving up, but nobody can fill it. China's involved in large infrastructure development, has been. Germany has increased its funding, focusing on sustainable development. The EU has increased its money going into healthcare. The Gulf Cooperation Council has increased its funding in the Gulf countries, focusing on security and disaster aid. And those are really the big ones that have stepped up, along with the regional banks. And there are regional banks throughout the country. There are 11 of them. And they focus on, market-based solutions to problems and creating public and private partnerships. And the Inter-American Bank, Asian Development Bank, African Development Banks are examples. And they get their funding through borrowing. They borrow money. Member country contributions, earnings of their bank operations and then donor grants. So they still exist and are working, but of course a large part of their their funding came from U.S. money, so their funding base has declined, and it doesn't seem like many countries are in a position to increase what they've been spending, and certainly not to offset what has been lost by the U.S. pulling out. So I don't see it increasing until and unless the U.S. gets back involved in international development.
Michelle?
No, thank you. I don't have much more to add. Very sadly, the U.S. was the largest bilateral donor in many, many countries where we worked. And a lot of the other donors have also scaled back their assistance as well. And the UN is also feeling the pressure, because of course we were a main contributor to, organizations like UNICEF and UNDP, et cetera, and the World Food Program. And so with the withdrawal of our support, they've been struggling very much as well with serious funding cuts and abilities to address crises around the world.
So Kevin, you said that for those who are familiar with China's Belt and Road Initiative, and if that's focused on infrastructure, we'll build you a dam, we'll build you a road, we'll build you an airport. Do they have any interest in the humanitarian aid that we've been mentioning?
No, they haven't put much money in humanitarian aid. They look very much at what they can do to develop infrastructure to benefit their economy.
That's right.
So they're looking at mineral extraction, raw material extractions, different activities that position their economy to do well.
Yeah.
So their mission or their attitude toward development was very, very different than the traditional American view.
Now, not all is gone. It's not like, oh my gosh, is anybody doing anything out there? You're at Purdue University, very large, well-known school. When we were in Lebanon, our pharmacist at a local drugstore got her pharmacology degree at Purdue. And I think every time we walked in, she was going to cry because she was so homesick. She really missed Purdue. Why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the work that is being done with a place like Purdue University that's been a very, it's been a contractor of some very large grants over the years, primarily in the field that Purdue would bring in the areas of agriculture and technology, engineering, and so forth, but substantial grants and continuing. Tell us about that. How is it that Purdue is continuing along, and where's this grant money coming from?
So traditionally, USAID and the US government has looked to universities and research institutes around the world for assistance in technical assistance, research, and teaching. And Purdue is one of the institutions that has participated in that. In the 60s, Purdue helped establish an engineering program in Kabul. Am I still on? Hello?
No, you are. You're on.
Oh.
We see you. I just
Okay,
have to.
In the 60s, Purdue helped establish an engineering college at Kabul University in Afghanistan. In the late 60s, early 70s, Purdue Ag College helped establish an agriculture college in Brazil. And I think 34 land-grant universities helped establish agriculture schools in the developing countries around the world. So Purdue got in it very, very, very early. And Purdue's involvement has been both in agriculture and engineering, but Purdue had the school in Brazil, which was their first main endeavor. And most of the faculty in the College of Agriculture went to Brazil to teach and help establish the college for a 2 or 3 year period over the 11 years of that grant. Then in the 90s, Purdue had a contract with USAID to establish a planning and policy department for the Ministry of Agriculture in Morocco. And part of that was having a few Purdue faculty in Morocco in the Ministry of Agriculture and having several people from the ministry there come to the US, Purdue, and other universities for graduate education. And more recently, Purdue has had hosted what's called Feed the Future, Feed the Future Innovation Lab, and it was a lab set up to promote food safety worldwide. And the intention was to link an American university with a university or institution in foreign countries to help them improve the food chain, especially regarding safety. The idea was to build capacity there so that it would increase trade and safer trade for those countries, both regionally and with the U.S. And then our Purdue's biggest program in the last 25 years was really Afghanistan. From 2004 to 2019, we were involved with Afghanistan, working on rebuilding the institutions of agriculture colleges, the Ministry of Agriculture, and parts of the Ministry of Public Health to help modernize their agriculture sector. And in that, we had about 30 Purdue faculty visit Afghanistan for short term to do things, and then also had 78 people come to Purdue for graduate degrees. And we involved a lot of Afghans in the U.S. for short term. And when they were here, we interacted a lot with them across the university and had them pretty well integrated into the community. So people in the West Lafayette community would get a good sense of what Purdue was doing, but also what was happening in Afghanistan. And about the time that the Taliban came back in, the Purdue graduates and a couple University of California Davis graduates had just assumed leadership positions in the Ministry of Agriculture. Up to the time they got in, they were people who were political appointees who really had no background in agriculture. So we were beginning to professionalize the agriculture ministry, but things fell apart too quickly.
Michelle, you mentioned the importance of the Foreign Service nationals. And USAID was created in part to strategically address the threats of encroaching global communism in developing countries in post-World War II world and the developing Cold War. How will USAID's institutional memory about post-war reconstruction and the continuing efforts that we've talked about be retained if most of its staff are hired? Now, we've talked about this when we were preparing, that when Doge came in, not caring much about anything, just files have been lost and computers and so forth have been trashed. But a lot of us have a hard time imagining this won't be picked up in some way. So how will this institutional memory, if not retained, how will some be regained with everybody gone? Well, how do you envision that happening?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's something that as we were in the process of being fired and shutting down was very concerning and painful to many of us. USAID had built up over decades, deep store of knowledge, not just in people's brains, but also online. It was called the Development Experience Clearinghouse, or the DEC, where we stored evaluations going back, for many, many years, evaluations of our programs. And we also had reports that, we submitted. They were mandatory reports we submitted to Congress. We had annual reports on our results, annual reports on our budgets, on our spending. And, this is something that infuriated me deeply, as well as many others, the accusations from Doge that USAID was somehow hiding things, being non-transparent. We were doing things behind the American public's back. when in reality, if so many members of the American public had known we existed before Doge stepped in, they could have gone online and accessed, thousands and thousands of pages of information on where our money was going and what results we were achieving. And it was Doge that actually shut all of that down and removed that access. So I think that's a really important point to make, is that information was available to the public. Doge took it away almost 1 year ago today when they shut down USAID's website. We still had access to documents internally, and there was kind of a frantic effort to save what we could before we all lost access to our systems. We kind of triaged in. From my experience, I was in Colombia when everything happened, and we triaged and put together what we felt were the most critical documents for our State Department colleagues to pass on to them, so they would not be lost forever. But of course, that was just a small fraction of what we had. There have been some larger efforts on the part of USAID Foreign Service officers, retirees, Foreign Service nationals, to work in partnership with different universities to house kind of a lot of this data as well. That's all been, independent efforts, of course, not at all supported by this administration to retain any of that information that we did so transparently make available to the public.
But there could be some energy there in a few years if it was. There are two important questions I want to get to that the panel is very keen to talk about, and one of them is there is action within Congress with excessive amount of money. But before we go into our public Q&A, and there's two questions I want to address before we go into it. But can you very quickly, Michelle, just say, because the question has been asked, well, people didn't know what USAID did. It was like, why didn't, and I've said, well, people were so busy working on the ground, doing what their jobs were, and very far away. It's not like they were running marketing campaigns here in the US. But why didn't the USAID, or didn't they ever envision this would happen to them? That they ever said to the American public, this is what we do.
Mm-hmm.
This is why you should care.
No, that's a great question. The reason that we didn't publicize our work in the US is because we weren't allowed to. We were actually not allowed to use our resources to publicize our work in the United States. We, had, of course, social media presence and such, and we worked with local press. But we,
like in the countries, right?
Correct. Sorry, yeah, that's what I meant by local, in the countries where we work. But we were actually not allowed to do any sort of advocacy or PR type of work within the United States. So we were, again, following the law. We were using funds responsibly. We were using funds the way they were intended by Congress in the countries where we worked. Can you imagine the outcry if we had been using appropriated taxpayer dollars for a marketing campampign for ourselves in the United States instead of for development for the world's poorest people? That was our purpose, was not to market ourselves. Our purpose was to support our own national security in the US and to support the development of those who needed it.
Well, yes, I've heard no end of people, friends of mine.
I'd add, Betty, that
Kevin,
there was a lot of congressional support. I mean, the work of USAID was well known in Congress, and
including by Senator Rubio, who was one of our biggest champions once upon a time.
Yeah.
But we're talking about if the people, we all might remember that the Peace Corps, I haven't seen it recently, actually in recent years, which predates the current administration, but the Peace Corps used to have the coolest ads, the really coolest ads, particularly in print media, and I'd see them on TV, making it a very attractive thing. You might want to think about this.
But that was for recruiting. for recruiting
Oh,
volunteers.
sure, absolutely. This would have been sort of displaying. I think all of us have heard the criticisms of the comic books, and I would try to explain because of my experience overseas that in many of these countries, illiteracy was really high. And if you're trying to get information out there about health, public health, HIV, what have you, if you had to display it even in a comic book, I saw a lot of that in Lesotho where people would read this and at least get, what are you going to do? Give them a brochure and they can't read of a lot of data. And but it was really hard for people to understand. But that's really, it's interesting. We don't have time to explore that, but I think I'm going to. Kevin and Ken, very, very quickly, please, because we want to get on to the last critical question. Can you just say right now, in addition to the national security and soft power, how else did U.S. benefit from all of these decades of U.S. foreign assistance?
Well, one way, Betty, and this really goes to a lot of Kevin's work as well, is that foreign assistance has a domestic constituency.
Yeah.
And Congress knows this very, very well. When you think about agricultural assistance, for example, those soybeans, the wheat, those are grown by American farmers. And the contractors themselves, like FHI 360 or Chemonics, those are American companies. Some are for profit, some are not for profit, but those are American companies, that have employees and they spend huge amounts of money inside the United States. So, so there's a constituency within the United States for foreign assistance. And another important point is that Congress also knows very well that when it comes to national security, development is an important component, as we talked about. And as you mentioned, USAID's budget was less than 1% of the federal budget. The Defense Department's percentage of the budget is 14%. So foreign assistance is a bargain in terms of promoting national security.
But Betty, as you
Yeah.
mentioned, the Marshall Plan and the other efforts to rebuild Japan and then South Korea and Taiwan have had tremendous impacts on the U.S. I mean, the Marshall Plan cost $13.2 billion when it was implemented, which is about $133 billion now, and they produce $1.5 trillion a year in trade with the U.S. They're 18% of our trade. Tremendous benefit for European countries as well as the U.S. And Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan likewise are major trading partners. So because of this economic interaction, it strengthens political ties, but also economic ties.
This is a bit anecdotal, but I think, wasn't it Bob Gates? We've heard the story that would say when he would go before Congress, for every dollar you spend on USAID, that's $3 we don't have to spend on bullets, sort of anecdotally along those lines. And even though maybe anecdotally, it was echoed by a lot of generals in the military. The final question before we go into the public is, in the midst of all this, we talk about Congress. A bill by a language committee that I describe it in my classes from both the Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives have agreed on a compromised bill to fund U.S. foreign assistance to the tune of $50 billion. That's $10 billion more than USAID, less than the overall foreign aid, but $10 billion more than USAID. With the language, the House passed the bill and it was bipartisan. The Senate has yet to pass it, and Trump may not sign it. But Congress was open to passing foreign aid funding at a level higher than just USAID. And given all this tumult, how has Congress continued to support foreign assistance? We can talk about where it's going. But they sat silent with the dismantling, which was their purview. This was in Article 1, their purview, and they sat silent, but now they're doing this. Can the panel please make sense of this? Who would like to address this? Michelle, you
Yeah.
also,
Michelle, yeah.
Michelle? I'm sure Michelle has.
Sure. Oh, I have
So
so
I
many
can
thoughts. I have so many thoughts. Um, no, I mean, really, it's been incredibly disappointing. That Congress has basically rolled over and done very little. Um, Over my 17 plus years um, in as a foreign service officer with USAID, we hosted many what were known as CODELs, congressional delegations. So senators, Congress representatives, their staffers from the Republican and Democratic Party in the countries where we went. We expended great effort to take them to see our projects, to travel around the countries, to show them what we were doing, to brief them on what we were doing. And many of those, including Republicans, were outwardly supportive. And then many of those, even those who were once extremely supportive, just let this all happen. When USAID, when the full dismantling began, there was a big rally outside of the Reagan building in Washington, D.C., which had been our headquarters. Multiple Democratic congressmen and women and senators stood there in solidarity and having a press conference. Not a single Republican member of the U.S. Congress showed up. So it's been incredibly disappointing and disheartening to see just how much either their views have changed or how scared they are for their own political futures of challenging anything that this executive is
Yeah, but it's baffling because this is a bipartisan support.
Yes, historically, it has been a bipartisan issue.
But this is just this recent, this is like really.
It has been, yes, within the past year that all of a sudden it is no longer bipartisan. And that Republican members of the appropriations committees apparently don't care that the Trump administration is not spending money as they directed by law, given that Congress should hold the power of the purse. So, and much has been written about this, and it's just been very disappointing and quite frankly frightening to see how quickly our system of checks and balances can start to dissolve.
Right. But this is a recent bill, which is baffling. I mean, given what you're saying, this is.
So I think our traditional view of technical assistance or any kind of aid is prevent conflict, contain adversaries, promote democracy, and promote trade. And the current administration has thrown that out the window and now says America first. So everything that's done in any sector of the U.S. economy or government is really looking at putting the U.S. first and using things like tariffs instead of soft power to beat people into place. And it seems like the president met some friction today.
Yeah, it did.
But it's a very, very different country today than it was 5 years ago.
Yes, but let's go back to this particular bill, because what this bill is also intended to fund is going to be traditional humanitarian projects related to health. And so, and you are right, what you're saying, they've kind of lost their soul in this. But then why would they then turn around in a bipartisan? It's just passed the House, hasn't passed the Senate. There's no guarantee that Trump will sign off on this. Kevin, you want
Betty, there's another reason for this.
Yeah.
For the last, I would say, 10 years, there's been a bipartisan consensus in Congress, in the Obama administration, first Trump administration, Biden administration. There's a bipartisan consensus that China represents a economic and security threat to the United States. And so when you look at this bill that's now working its way through Congress, there is a section of the bill called Countering China. So both Democrats and Republicans realize that this is a much less inexpensive way of pushing back against Chinese influence, obviously than military action. But this bipartisan consensus on the need to counter Chinese influence is really an important part of the reason why it has that support.
Do we know when we say bipartisan, we know how close the House and Senate are, real close. So bipartisan could be 5 members from the other chamber. Do we know how many Republicans voted for this?
Well, you could look at the sponsors. Who are the sponsors in the House? Who are the sponsors in the Senate?
Did you have a chance to see that, Ken?
No, but if you go, if you were to go to, I don't know, Chat GPT and just ask it to list the, that's the way I would do it.
Okay, that's a quick way.
Yeah.
That's almost Google anymore. Google, because when you ask Google anything, you immediately get AI response.
Yeah,
so, dear chat, forget Google.
Yeah, but if you have the number of the bill, you can find who the sponsors are.
Okay. Do you know the number offhand?
I don't have it in front of me now.
You brought this to us, you see. I'm putting you on the spot.
Put me on the spot.
Okay. There are other questions that we could ask, but this may be time now to go to public Q&A. Ray?
Thanks, Betty. Actually, I don't have any questions yet in the chat room. If you do have a question now, you want to, I think you can use your hand raise thing, or we can actually see everybody pretty easily. So if you have a question, want to raise your hand, that's fine.
Well, people are waiting. Maybe one of the questions we could ask is, the panel, while people are thinking about the question, we want to hear from you.
Well, actually, I do have a question I could ask in the meantime. I want to ask Michelle. You mentioned earlier, through in the introduction, that you had worked on drug trade with Venezuela. So, is the reduction in foreign aid to developing countries, especially ones that produce drug crops, has this kind of forced farmers to migrate back to grazing these crops that can be converted into drugs?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And sorry, I was just looking up on congress.gov. It looked like the roll call vote on this bill was 341 yays and 79 nays. I haven't broken that down by party. If I'm doing this quickly, so I think I'm looking at the right bill. But that's where that stands.
Is the bill we just talked about?
Yes. I just looked up very quickly, but it's very quickly because I'm multitasking.
What was the count again, please?
341 yays and 79 nays.
That's not bad.
But I don't take my word for it. I'd have to go back and just make sure it was the correct bill, but I'm pretty sure it was. But to Ray's question, yes. So when I was serving most recently in Colombia, and we did a lot of work on countering the narcotics trade there. And I think was it Ken, I believe, who was speaking about the military and how the importance of diplomacy, development, and defense. Yes, thank you. That was the count for HR 7006, 341 to 79. And we all had a role to play, and not one of us could have done that on our own. And so, for example, our military and State Department colleagues with the Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement worked with our Colombian military and law enforcement counterparts to secure areas that were controlled by illegal armed groups, including narco trafficking groups, and areas that were facing significant levels of violence and conflict. USAID then went in with our development programs to support those communities. One of our largest programs that we had there was a land tenure program where former coca growers who agreed to eradicate their crops were given a land title, which is something that is extremely valuable to Colombian farmers. You have, once you have a land title, you have proof that you own that land. People can't just take it away from you. And so we were seeing some real results from that program and reductions in coca growth. We were also working with the Colombian government and strengthening their national land agency to be able to do this. And we also then provided these farmers who were eradicating their crops with assistance to grow different crops, and most importantly, links to markets for those crops, so that they could have a licit legal livelihood going forward and be less susceptible to future outbreaks of violence and threats from illegal armed groups. So that was a very concrete program, and a program that was having success that is no longer happening. And you can use the military all you want to bomb boats and clear areas, but if you don't have that soft power, that foreign assistance to go in and sustain it, then you're just going to have to keep bombing. And that gets real deadly, real ugly, and real expensive real fast.
All right, thank you. Sarah Shaler had her hand up there. Sarah, you still with us? She was there a second ago. I saw her. Well, before Sarah comes back, I did have a kind of follow-up question for Michelle about the data from the website. Has that been archived, or do you think it's deleted?
I sincerely doubt that the tech bros from Doge archived it. Anything that was saved was done so either by USAID staff like myself, sharing documents with State Department colleagues to retain, or through other independent efforts to archive that data and house it somewhere outside the US government.
Okay, thank you.
One of the questions,
Sarah, you there yet?
Well, when she comes, one of the questions the panel can address that we did bring up is there is a vision by a lot of people for when we move through an administration that has a different policy toward foreign aid, and we get back perhaps to understanding the need, because of all the reasons we've talked about tonight, which have been no secret for decades. What's that going to look like? We're
Well,
just not.
I think that's a critical question.
USAID, so what will that look like?
It's a critical question. I mean, if USAID were being developed today instead of 1963, would it look different?
Yeah.
And I think looking forward, a lot of the question that has to be answered is, how do you effectively develop an agency that can develop and implement humanitarian development programs that are effective? And there were a lot of criticisms of USAID for its bureaucracy and inefficiency. And if you look at the final report by Seeger, the special evaluation program for Afghanistan, they said from 2001 through 2020, Afghanistan received 16% of USAID funding. And they said some of it was marginally effective, most of it was not effective. So obviously, the plan to utilize aid in Afghanistan, as well as a lot of things in Afghanistan, was a misassignment of resources. So could it have been done differently? How it could have been done to be more effective? I'm not sure what the evaluations are in other countries that get a lot of money, but I think looking forward, it would help for those people who were involved in USAID and other international efforts to try and put together ideas of what could be done to create a more efficient agency.
Okay, great.
That,
All right, Lee Thompson, do you have a question?
Yeah. Um, Leah Thompson. So I graduated with my PhD in 2024, and my PhD was um, mostly funded from USAID. I was part of the Feed the Future Food Safety Innovation Lab, amongst some others. And so as soon as I luckily was able to get my PhD in time, but I think all the panelists can relate to the just absolute dread and disappointment um, that you feel when you found out about everything that was just falling apart. Um, that said, what are your thoughts or predictions on, let's say that yes, there is a future of foreign aid and development in the U.S. 5 years from now, or what do you think it could look like 5 years from now or 15 years from now? Um, and I say that as someone who got into the more qualitative research of development. To Kevin's point on efficiency, how can we evaluate things in a different way? How do we measure success? Is everything, what does that process look like? How do you see that affecting the future of aid in the U.S.?
well, I think everywhere food security is a big issue. And one of the things that's driving it is the lack of water and the impacts of environmental change. And someone in food science who has a background in storage, processing, production related to efficient use of natural resources, I think would be well positioned to get involved. The idea of water management is just critical. I'm working in Afghanistan now with some people, and they're predicting that Kabul University is going to run out of water by 2030. And the agriculture, they've had a drought the last 4 years, and people put in ghost wells. People couldn't get water, surface water, so they dug deep wells, and now the water table is too low for the surface water system to distribute water once there's sufficient water. So, those issues are just critical, and then, the public health issues are just tremendous as well. Um, uh, maternity health for mothers and children. Um, but in agriculture and in natural resources, I think you're well positioned to do something. It might be a little different. Did you work with Amanda Deering? Haley Oliver?
Adjacently, Haley Oliver was on my committee. Paul Ebner was my
Oh,
PI.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they would be good people to talk to about what kind of opportunities they see opening up, especially Paul. Paul's really innovative. The others are
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. So some of my research went into and not to hijack the conversation, some of my research started to explore actually more of that social science side of development. And like that's where that qualitative research came into play. And I kind of worry that if we have this revised version of foreign aid, we're going to go even more so in the everything must be quantifiable and measurable to justify its existence. When the reality is there are so many things like labor assessments or gender assessments where you can't really measure success or outputs super easily. Sometimes it's not straightforward, and I fear that we're going to go back towards that everything must be quantifiable and measurable.
Well, I think you want to be quantifiable and measurable, but in agriculture sciences, in environmental sciences, to look at food safety issues and look at water conservation issues and those things. Those are going to drive food security all over the world. You know,
Yeah.
those social issues are very, very important as well. But the science, hard science stuff is really important also.
Yeah. I think I just worry the most about it's really great when we can implement a new technology in foreign countries, but what's the longevity and the long-term adoption? What's the capacity development going to look like after we leave? How can we ensure that? Um, do the panelists, you, Kevin, and the rest of the panelists, do you see a space where we can operate in those spaces?
Well, I'll give you an example. I just came from Pakistan, and their conflict between India and Pakistan over access to the headwaters of the Ganges River and the Indus River, that's actually fueling much of the underlying tension between the two countries. Foreign assistance, actually, when I was there, we were providing assistance to the government of Pakistan in understanding how to manage their water in order to reduce conflict with India. So there's a good example where water is a source of very, very severe conflict between two countries that frequently go to war with each other. And if the United States can help, alleviate that scarcity mentality through the better management of water, then that can prevent a major conflict between two nuclear armed countries.
And some of the conflict between Afghanistan and Pakistan is over water rights. And then Afghanistan's starting to take water from the Aryub River, that's the northern border, and it's creating water shortages in Central Asia. So it's becoming a real political issue. And those issues are going to become more severe, not less severe.
I'm wondering, Leah, when you say your work focused on qualitative and you're worried about the quantitative, in this period of time before, because there will be something in the future, and you're a young woman, and you'll be there and ready to move into helping to assist with that new vision. Is there something you can do in this period of time to sort of shore up more areas of understanding of the quantitative, the value of the quantitative research to apply also with your qualitative work?
Yeah, I think usually, well, methodologically speaking, I'm a big fan of mixed methods research. I think they complement each other very well. But I guess it all goes back to, is the US government going to feel that it is worth investing this money in these types of situations where we could alleviate conflict by improving water conservation or water usage, even though in the immediate future it doesn't directly affect us. I definitely see where someone with maybe my background, for example, or someone with food safety, with more of a food safety background, could be utilized. But to what extent do we feel that the US government will eventually come around to that this is justifiable to allocate funds to this still?
So if you look at water scarcity issues, I mean, if you look what's happening with the corn area in the Southwest, it's being converted to sorghum because of water shortages. So water issues in agriculture in the U.S. are a big concern. So those similar issues in worldwide affect the ability to produce food. So I think once we become more engaged in international development, those issues will be very, very important. I think the organization that implements them might be different than aid was when it was shut down. But I think the U.S. will be engaged in those kinds of activities.
All right. Actually, Sarah sent me a text here, or email so her question, and I'll paraphrase it for her, but I think really what she's asking is, are there particular areas that will probably get the most attention for foreign aid in the near future? For example, you've been talking about water and water shortages and food safety. Are there, if you had a list of, 5 areas that you thought the United States probably is going to focus on in terms of aid uh, for the foreseeable future, what might those be?
So, when USAID was shut down, um, we were required to do a full, what was called a foreign assistance review. But really it was uh, very much a sham because the decisions had already been made even before we filled out this extremely detailed spreadsheet and forms with analyses that we'd spent a long time thinking through about which programs we felt were most critical to continue. In the end, what was passed over to State Department was just the humanitarian assistance and some of the health programming. And so there's been some press recently around the State Department now developing these memoranda of understanding with host country, with the governments of developing countries to provide funds directly to those governments for health system strengthening. And this has been touted as, oh, finally, we will be using our funds, transparently and giving money directly where it should go, as if, A, this is the answer, and B, as if this is something brand new. It is neither of those. Number one, USAID had been doing what we called government to government, or G to G, in countries and in situations and sectors where it was appropriate, and where there was sufficient will on the part of the counterpart ministry and government, and sufficient expertise, and also where we had the staff to provide the oversight needed for those types of arrangements, funding arrangements. So we did do that, and it was very time consuming, required a lot of oversight, and was done very carefully and very much, specific to each country. So given that this administration has slashed our staff down to, as I mentioned, less than 10% of where we were, I don't see how we can responsibly manage that amount of funds. And in addition, to not having the staff to responsibly conduct the analyses needed and manage those funds, we've also completely eliminated the expertise that USAID had in terms of financial management, legal expertise, contracting, and we've removed any sort of complementary programming that we would have had in those situations. For example, Secretary Rubio recently publicized this, very large memorandum of understanding signed with Kenya to support health programming. So where we will give money apparently directly to the government of Kenya to do this. Again, this is something USAID had been doing, but now there is no longer, for example, complementary programming to strengthen civil society organizations to conduct oversight of the government, to make sure that those funds are being used in the way that they should be. We no longer have complementary programming to ensure that those funds don't inadvertently or advertently, depending on, a particular government in power, exacerbate existing inequalities in the country and thereby exacerbate, conflict and violence. So that is what is being funded right now. And again, without the expertise, thought, and oversight that we once had.
But as I look to the future, I think food security is going to be a critical issue worldwide. as well as health care, especially maternity care. And I'm not sure how they would be funded or how the programs would be implemented. But I think those are two areas that are going to remain cutting issues worldwide for some time, as well as other environmental issues. And again, in one day, we've jeopardized the U.S. capacity to manage and implement programs in those areas. But it's going to have to be rebuilt in some way, and those are going to be, I think, the critical issues to look at.
Dan, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, so I was just thinking that in the future that Congress is going to be again very interested in countering Chinese influence, and so they are going to be interested in civil society, in building up higher education, elementary, secondary education, public diplomacy. So, if the focus is on countering Chinese influence, then there's going to be a big cultural and political and civil society component to that aid as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right, thanks. Hey, Claire, you had a comment, question you wanted to, and then Lee, I'll get to Lee. Excuse me, Julianne, I'll get to you after Claire.
Well, I think some of it's been touched on, but I was wondering after this dreadful Trump regime is over, how quickly can you get back in business? You said.
Hi, so thank you for the question. I think taking it apart, breaking it down was a much faster process. I think it was much faster than any of us thought possible, to be honest. Building it back up, it's going to take a long time. Again, the staff you're going to have to rehire, so many staff, not just in the US, but around the world. And, it wasn't just the USAID staff, it was also all of our partner organizations and partner staff. For the most part, were also decimated. And so it's really rebuilding that whole, ecosystem that was working in the development sector. There are some organizations that are still operating with other funds, but there's going to be a lot that needs to be done. And for me, I think one of the biggest challenges will be rebuilding that trust in the countries where we worked, to convince people that they can actually trust that the US government will not just abandon people again.
Yeah, but I think there will be funds, and I think we'll figure out how to use them effectively. There's a big break, but I think for younger people looking at whether or not they should think about getting involved in development issues, I think there's a future there.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Julianne, do you want to ask your question? Go ahead.
Well, I thought it was really good when you were talking about how your programs were evaluated. But if this new 50,000 or a portion of it is for similar programs to USAID, how are you going to improve how the countries are picked, what projects are picked, how will you strengthen the partnership between Congress and what the USAID programming is going to be? What happened in the last 15 years? Was there a problem? I mean, how do we get to where we are today? And when we go forward, how will that be improved so we don't crash again?
Yeah, so Julianne, thank you. I'm looking at your question in the chat about kind of what was Congress's role in determining when, where, what, how, why, we did what we did. And the answer is that Congress, passed, most years, an appropriations bill that was quite specific in many ways in directing us in terms of what to do. to the point of giving USAID levels of funds that we had to spend in certain countries or certain regions, levels of funds that had to be spent in certain sectors, and even levels of funds that had to be spent sometimes for certain partner organizations or certain programs. So they were fairly specific. And even so, once we got that appropriations legislation, USAID and Congress went back and forth over a period of several months to negotiate the budget levels and how we were going to then break everything down and meet the levels that Congress set in the appropriations bill. And then subsequently, before we even spent a single cent, we in each country and each bureau within USAID Washington and then each country USAID mission, we had to draft what was known as a congressional notification. And so these were documents that were, about, depending on the complexity of the programming and the size of the budget, could be 15 to 20 pages that detailed with budget tables, both quantitative and qualitatively, what we were going to do with those funds, broken down by funding account and by sector. And we also listed the partner organizations that would be receiving those funds. And so we had to submit those before we could spend any money, and those had to sit with the appropriations committees in the House and the Senate, and also the foreign affairs committees in the House and the Senate for a minimum of 15 calendar days before we could do anything. And often they sat for longer because there were questions. And so we went back and forth with questions until those committees gave the all clear, the okay for us to then move forward. So this narrative that Congress didn't know what we were doing, that we weren't reporting, is just patently false.
Yeah.
And I think, I was very involved in Afghanistan, and Zalmay Khalilzad, an Afghan American, was the ambassador. And he interviewed me and wanted to hire me to work at the embassy. He told me that if I would come there, I would be one of 3 Dari-speaking U.S. governments working there. Nobody had any idea what they were doing. And, this big USAID budget got wrapped into the Afghanistan program, and it wasn't very well thought out. So it was kind of built to fail. When Petraeus was named ambassador, he and Holbrooke wanted to spend more money, aid money in Afghanistan. And overnight, they gave me $35 million to tack on to a $15 million project. There was no way I could spend it effectively. Yeah, we were rebuilding an agriculture college, and you can't do that without training faculty. And we couldn't use the money. And unfortunately, Fulbright died about a month later. But the money was taken back by USAID when Fulbright was no longer there working with Petraeus. But giving USAID realistic objectives and the power to implement them I think, is critical to the agency being successful.
Yeah, I'll give you a quick example of the close relationship that sometimes occurred between Congress and USAID. When I was president of the American University of Afghanistan, 85% of our budget came from USAID. I had to go to Congress 4 times a year, and I spent a week each trip, and I would meet with members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, and their staff, and I would report to them on what the university was doing, what the university hoped to do. And they also, as Michelle mentioned, they would come to Afghanistan on these missions. And of course, I would have to receive them. So there you had a direct relationship between a USAID project and many members of Congress.
All right. Well, thank you. Betty, I see it's about the witching hour here. Do you want to kind of wrap up?
I want to thank you all for coming. You've been really a great audience. I appreciate, we had, as some of you know, as we said in some of our emails going out that we had the program in September, but we had audio issues and the recording was not audible. And we felt very strongly, ICWA felt very strongly, given the incredible panel of expertise that we had and the sensitivity of the topic, that this would had to be recorded to be used in the classroom, to be used in a broad spectrum of ways as an educational tool. And also when Michelle says, you know, the past was shredded. Well, the history and the knowledge and outcomes cannot be shredded. And I think what the panelists talked about this evening is part of that, not just posterity like a nostalgia sense, but important work that was done and what it achieved. And if we're going to benefit anything from this, it will be that when this is rebuilt again, that we will take, as Kevin has pointed out several times, rightfully so, what are the mistakes we don't want to repeat? What did we learn in the first round that we can improve on the efficiencies? And there's nothing wrong with that. A lot of us wept bitterly when this took place, but we can turn this around. Some of us are very determined that we will. Leah, you hang in there. You know, you're a young person, and so the future is very bright for you and having a role in that. I look at my 15 years overseas as the most meaningful work I ever did in my life. And I have to laugh because we also had started our family overseas. And so many people would say, oh my goodness, what did your children do overseas? Well, they had great childhoods without TV. If you can imagine that, it was absolutely wonderful. So I want to thank you for coming and sharing. So this is important that we recorded this. We are going to start in February, 2 months of Great Decisions. We want to remind you, many of you come. Great Decisions is, I think, Janet, you call it the longest running discussion in America about foreign policy and aid, what is timely and what is urgent. And we work very closely with the Foreign Policy Association in doing that. In that particular program series for ICWA, we are actually given the topics by the Foreign Policy Association, but then it is up to us to find the credible speakers like we have this evening. We do have a journal that goes with that. And if I can show, oh my goodness, who's got their journal on hand? Does anybody have their journal on hand? Mine is not on hand. Oh, there we go. The Great Decisions. And how much is it sold for? $35 or something like that in the neighborhood. If you contact us, we would love to get a journal in your hands. Our speakers did not lecture from that. Our first program is going to be on Tuesday, February the 3rd. It will be Professor George Lopez from Notre Dame University, who's going to talk about the future of democracy and human rights. Or international law and human rights. And that'll be a very, very interesting topic. That too has been sort of rocky most recently with the administration. What does that look like? What is going on? But that'll be a really great topic. Professor Lopez was one of the founders for the Kroc-Hesburgh Institute of International Affairs and Learning at Notre Dame. And a very interesting story with that. The Kroc is, this is Joan Kroc, who's married to Ray Kroc. If anybody saw the movie, whatever it was called, the Ray Kroc was not the founder of McDonald's. It was the McDonald's brothers and in California. But Ray Kroc was a visionary selling his double mixer machine.
Milkshake machine.
His what?
Milkshake machine.
Yeah, the milkshake machines. And then he it's a sort of a movie that he kind of took over. But he was married to Joan Kroc. And as a widow, she had a tremendous amount of money. He became a deep philanthropist. And she and Father Ted Hesburgh, president of Notre Dame, were deeply involved in developing. They were good friends. And she gave a great bit of money to help the university develop this institute, studying peace and humanitarian assistance and so forth. And the discussion that Joan and Ted would have is, well, Ted, I really think it should be named for you. Oh, no, Joan, it really should be named for you. Ted, I insist it must go to you. And so back and forth. So it's a double named institute. But you don't want to miss it. We kick it off February the 3rd. And then every single week for 8 sequential weeks, we have a topic, again, with great speakers. You'll love it. We love presenting it for you. And with that, does anybody, Ray or Jana, have anything to say before we say goodnight? It's been wonderful having you with us. Thank you
Yeah.
to the panel. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Kenneth. You were wonderful to work with, and you really brought it home, the importance of USAID and foreign aid. We got through it without crying.